It is barely 5:15 on a bruised, fog-choked October morning here on the edges of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and I am standing alone on the damp timber of my private dock, the bitter steam from a battered thermos mug curling up into the freezing air, just staring out at the silhouette of a meticulously restored 1984 Boston whaler as it bobs, heavy and perfect, in the black water. The scent of pine needles, decaying autumn leaves, and deep, mineral-rich lake water fills my lungs, wrapping around me like a familiar, aching ghost, a sensory echo of my late wife, Eleanor, whose calloused, beautiful hands spent 3 grueling years sanding and sealing that very hull while leukemia slowly, violently stripped the life from her bones. And then, shattering the sacred, fragile silence of my morning, comes the sharp, invasive crunch of imported limestone gravel, followed by the aggressive, staccato clicking of designer heels marching down my weathered wooden planks, forcing me to turn around and face the absolute last thing a grieving man wants to see before the sun is even up. Standing there, flanked by 2 miserable-looking lackeys clutching clipboards like shields, is Victoria Sterling, the self-appointed aristocratic dictator of the Cypress Point Property Owners Association, wrapped in a cashmere coat that probably costs more than my first car, her eyes narrowed in a look of absolute, unvarnished disdain. This rusted monstrosity is a catastrophic violation of our shoreline beautification covenants, she snaps, her voice slicing through the morning fog like a scalpel hitting bone, echoing off the water with a terrifying entitlement, before she casually drops the hammer, telling me I have exactly 48 hours to drag my dead wife's sanctuary out of the water or face a crushing penalty of $500 a day. If you have ever had some neighborhood tyrant try to rip the last remaining piece of your shattered heart right off your own property, you know exactly how the blood suddenly stops moving in your veins. So tell me down in the comments where you are watching from and how your state handles these suburban dictators, because what happened next is a masterclass in why you never, ever back a wounded animal into a corner. To truly understand the gravity of the war that was about to ignite, you need to know that I am Arthur Pendleton, a 68-year-old retired land use attorney who spent 4 decades fighting massive, soulless corporations, a man who thought he had seen the absolute bottom of human greed until I met the board members of my own neighborhood. Eleanor and I bought this little slice of forested heaven back in 1985 for a laughable $42,000, a time when this area was nothing but working-class fishermen, gravel roads, and quiet nights, long before the monstrous, glass and steel McMansions began sprouting like glittering weeds, driving our property taxes into the stratosphere and pushing the land value well over the $1 million mark. But Eleanor, my fierce, union-proud pipefitter wife, whose hands were permanently stained with axle grease and love, didn't care about the real estate boom. She just wanted a place where the loons would sing her to sleep, spending her final, agonizing months in our detached garage, the smell of fiberglass resin masking the scent of the chemotherapy, pouring her fading soul into that Boston whaler so that she could leave me something that would always keep me afloat. The Cypress Point Property Owners Association didn't even exist until 6 years ago, born out of a hostile takeover by wealthy transplants like Victoria Sterling and her husband, Richard Sterling, a ruthless corporate defense attorney who owns the Sterling and Vance Law Group, a man who drives a slate-gray Porsche and looks at the original residents of this lake like we are a disease that needs to be surgically removed. Their game was brutally transparent, weaponizing absurd aesthetic guidelines to bleed out the elderly, fixed-income residents, hoping to force us to sell our pristine lakefront lots to their developer cronies at a fraction of the value. And Victoria had chosen me as her next victim, presenting a completely fabricated, highly suspicious land survey conducted by her own cousin's firm, claiming my dock was suddenly in violation of a setback rule that hadn't applied for 35 years. When I demanded a formal hearing to dispute this blatant, coordinated fraud, she smiled that venomous, practiced smile and scheduled the community meeting for 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, the exact hour when she knew damn well the older population was either napping at the pharmacy or sitting in waiting rooms at the cardiology clinic, resulting in a pathetic, manufactured quorum where 3 of her hand-picked cronies voted to place a lien on my home if I didn't send Eleanor's boat to a scrapyard. The audacity of it, the sheer, calculating cruelty of attacking a widower who was still sleeping on only one side of the bed, sent a shockwave of ice-cold clarity straight through my grieving fog. But I didn't truly realize the scale of their assault until 2 days later, when I pulled into my driveway with a grocery bag containing a pint of pistachio ice cream, Eleanor's favorite, which I still buy just to keep in the freezer so she doesn't feel entirely gone, only to find my iron mailbox strangled by half a dozen thick, neon yellow plastic zip ties, binding a stack of laminated violation notices to the metal. Ripping those thick plastic bands off with freezing, trembling hands, I read through a list of infractions so completely unhinged they felt hallucinatory. A fine for my deck sealant fading to the wrong shade of charcoal, a penalty for parking my utility trailer too close to a pine tree, and a $200 citation for displaying unsanctioned lawn ornaments, which referred to the 3 small, faded stone frogs Eleanor had placed near the hydrangeas a decade ago. They wanted nearly $4,000 in 10 days, signed by the neighborhood compliance officer, who turned out to be Victoria's 19-year-old nephew, a kid who spent his afternoons creeping through my rhododendrons with an iPhone, snapping photos of my sorrow like he was hunting game. Most people would crumble under the terrifying, legalistic weight of a property lien, the anxiety eating them alive in the middle of the night. But they had fundamentally miscalculated who I was, forgetting that a retired land-use lawyer facing down an existential threat doesn't panic. He goes straight to the basement archives of the Walworth County Courthouse, a place that smells of ancient dust, floor wax, and secrets that cannot be deleted by a corrupt HOA board. Spreading my original, yellowing plat maps across a cold steel table, under the flickering hum of fluorescent lights, I sat with Mildred, a clerk who had been working those files since the Carter administration, tracing the faded ink of my property lines, my heart stopping entirely when I realized that not only did my lot extend nearly 60 feet further out into the lake than their fake survey claimed, but that the HOA had been illegally charging their wealthy members an annual premium to fish in a cove that was entirely, legally, undeniably mine. "Oh, sweetheart," Mildred whispered, adjusting her glasses and tapping a beautifully preserved addendum from the late 80s. "Your wife came in here years ago and bought the riparian rights to this entire northern quadrant." She locked it down tight. The air left my lungs in a violent rush, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel as I drove straight to the Geneva State Bank, demanding access to a safety deposit box I hadn't opened since the funeral, the metallic click of the lock echoing in the quiet vault like a gunshot. There, sitting beneath a stack of old savings bonds and a lock of her hair, was a manila envelope with my name written in Eleanor's beautiful, steady handwriting, containing the ironclad, state-certified water rights to 15 acres of the lake, accompanied by a small, tear-stained sticky note that read, "Arthur, if the wolves ever come for our home, show them who owns the water. I built a fortress around you. I love you." Sitting alone in the driver's seat of my truck in the bank parking lot, holding that piece of paper against my chest, I wept until I couldn't breathe, crushed by the realization that while I thought my wife had left me alone to face the darkness, she had actually spent her final, healthy years laying a trap so devastating, so legally insurmountable, that it was going to wipe these arrogant, entitled monsters off the map. And as the tears finally dried, leaving behind a cold, terrifying calm, I looked in the rearview mirror, knowing that the grieving widower they thought they were bullying was dead, replaced by a man who was about to burn their entire fabricated world to the ground. If you think a woman who drives a $100,000 SUV and measures her self-worth by the uniformity of her neighbor's driveway gravel is going to back down easily, you have never dealt with the deep, festering rot of suburban privilege, because 3 nights later, I woke up to a sound that makes any mariner's blood run instantly cold. The heavy, sloshing, unnatural rhythm of a boat taking on water in the dark. Sprinting down to the dock in nothing but my flannel pajamas and a pair of old rain boots, the freezing October wind slicing through me, I found the Boston whaler listing dangerously to the port side, the black water bubbling up through a jagged, deliberate puncture wound near the waterline, violently stabbed through the fiberglass with what looked like a heavy-duty awl or a sharpened screwdriver. Wading waist-deep into the agonizingly cold lake, my muscles cramping, I managed to muscle the hull toward the shallows, but the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the white-hot, blinding rage expanding in my chest, a fury that only intensified when I checked the hidden, motion-activated trail cameras I had installed in the Weeping Willows after the mailbox incident. The grainy, green-tinted night vision footage showed exactly what I expected: a cowardly figure in a dark hooded sweatshirt, creeping along the perimeter of my property at 3 in the morning, plunging a tool into the side of Eleanor's legacy before scurrying away like a rat in the night. Before the sun was even fully up, the absolute audacity of these people manifested in my mailbox yet again, this time disguised as a notice of environmental concern, signed by Victoria Sterling herself, sweetly informing me that my derelict, sinking vessel was now a hazard to the local ecosystem. And oh, wasn't it convenient that she had already taken the liberty of contacting a salvage team to haul it away? A salvage team that, after a 5-minute internet search, I discovered was owned by a shell company directly tied to Pinnacle Ridge Developments, the very corporate entity trying to buy up our side of the lake. They thought breaking the boat would break my spirit, failing to realize that when you are married to a union pipe fitter for almost 40 years, you absorb a reverence for physical labor. So I dragged my wife's heavy steel toolbox out of the garage, the metallic clanking echoing across the quiet water, and I spent the next 3 days bathed in the intoxicating, chemical smell of marine epoxy and hardeners, my hands covered in fiberglass dust, finding a profound, almost spiritual peace in the repetitive motion of sanding, patching, and curing the hull, feeling Eleanor standing right there over my shoulder, whispering to me to keep the edges smooth. While the epoxy cured under the autumn sun, the legal snare I was weaving grew infinitely tighter, starting with a long, strategic phone call to Diane, my former law partner who now ran a brutal, unforgiving environmental litigation firm in Madison, Wisconsin, her voice crackling over the speakerphone as she laughed, a dark, predatory sound, confirming that since I owned the riparian rights, the HOA had absolutely zero legal authority to regulate a single drop of water touching my property, and, worse, they had been committing actionable, systemic trespass for years by charging their members for fishing tournaments on my private acreage. The scope of this conspiracy began to terrifyingly expand when Harold, a fiercely proud, quiet Vietnam veteran who lived 3 houses down, knocked on my front door, holding a thick, meticulously organized binder, his eyes heavy with the same exhausted frustration I felt, revealing that he and 7 other original, elderly homeowners had been hit with the exact same wave of crushing fines, bizarre aesthetic complaints, and aggressive demands to paint their houses or remove their flagpoles. Spreading Harold's documents across my kitchen table alongside my own, the chilling, undeniable pattern emerged like blood seeping through a bandage. Every single targeted resident was over the age of 65. Every single house sat on premium, highly coveted deepwater lakefront, and every single wave of extreme harassment perfectly coincided with Pinnacle Ridge Developments presenting luxury resort zoning applications to the county board, proving this was never about property values or paint colors. It was a highly coordinated, financially motivated campaign of elder abuse designed to panic us into selling our generational homes for pennies on the dollar. We didn't just sit there and cry about it. We mobilized, turning my living room into a tactical command center, recruiting Dr. Eris Thorne, a brilliant aquatic ecologist from the Wisconsin Freshwater Conservatory, and Tommy, a burly, no-nonsense guy who ran the Geneva Bay Marina, pooling our resources to launch a devastating social media counteroffensive, posting scanned copies of my water deeds, the fake HOA surveys, and the undeniable financial links between the board and the developers. The internet response was a torrential downpour of public outrage, but the true, earth-shattering twist came at midnight, while I was digging through a box of Eleanor's medical records looking for an old tax receipt, and stumbled upon a heavily locked, fireproof lockbox she had hidden under a pile of old sweaters, containing hundreds of pages of state-certified water testing data, stamped photographs, and soil analysis reports. My brilliant, secretive wife hadn't just been battling cancer. She had spent her final years quietly proving that the brand-new, multi-million-dollar homes built by Victoria and her wealthy friends were operating with illegal, completely unpermitted septic systems, dumping raw, untreated sewage and massive amounts of phosphorus directly into the groundwater, suffocating the lake with toxic algae blooms. meaning the very people trying to evict me for a supposedly ugly boat were actually committing federal environmental crimes. When Richard Sterling, the arrogant lawyer husband, showed up at my front door a few days later, sweating through his expensive suit, nervously offering me a briefcase containing $200,000 in cash to quietly sign over my property and water rights, and subtly threatening to have a judge declare me mentally incompetent if I refused, he didn't know I was wearing a hidden digital recorder taped to my chest, capturing every single trembling, extortionist syllable he uttered, capturing the exact moment a dormant, apex predator woke up inside my soul, realizing that I wasn't just going to sue them, I was going to obliterate their entire existence. You can always tell when arrogant, powerful people realize the ground is crumbling beneath their feet, because their actions shift from calculated cruelty to sloppy, panicked desperation, a reality that became beautifully apparent at 4 a.m. when my newly installed, military-grade perimeter cameras captured Victoria Sterling's nephew sneaking down to my dock for a second time, this time carrying a massive, industrial jug of used motor oil, dumping the thick, black sludge directly into the pristine water right next to my boat, the neon, iridescent sheen of the pollution catching the moonlight like a poisonous rainbow. By 8 o'clock the next morning, the county environmental inspector was banging on my door, his face grim, ready to issue an emergency seizure of my property based on an anonymous tip about a catastrophic hazardous waste leak. But the look of absolute, soul-crushing humiliation that washed over his face when I quietly invited him into my kitchen, poured him a cup of coffee, and played the high-definition footage of the HOA president's family committing premeditated ecological terrorism on my television screen was a moment of pure, cinematic perfection. Knowing their window was closing, the Cypress Point Property Owners Association played their final, suicidal card, announcing a mandatory, emergency community meeting at the Cypress Point Community Center, printing flyers, inviting the local press, and openly declaring their intention to hold a public vote to forcibly seize my land, demolish my dock, and legally evict me for being a danger to the neighborhood, treating the whole affair like a grand, public execution where they would finally conquer the stubborn old man. The atmosphere inside that community hall was suffocating, heavy with the smell of cheap coffee, nervous sweat, and predatory anticipation. The room packed with over 200 people, including a row of executives from Pinnacle Ridge Developments sitting in the front row in matching tailored suits, looking like sharks smelling blood in the water, while Victoria stood at the podium, banging a wooden gavel, her face flushed with the intoxicating thrill of absolute power. I waited in the back of the room, my heart beating a slow, steady, terrifying rhythm against my ribs, flanked by my personal army. Diane in her sharpest litigator's suit, Harold standing tall in his perfectly pressed military dress uniform alongside a dozen other furious veterans, and Dr. Thorne clutching a briefcase full of devastating scientific truth. When Victoria finished her dramatic, tear-filled monologue about how my presence was destroying the natural harmony of our beloved lake, she smugly asked if I had any final words before the board voted to strip me of my home, expecting me to beg, expecting me to cry, expecting the broken widower she thought she had created. The silence in the room was deafening, the tension thick enough to choke on, as I slowly walked down the center aisle, holding nothing but a single, thick manila folder, the echo of my boots on the linoleum sounding like a ticking clock, until I reached the microphone, looked her dead in the eye, and pulled out the original deed to the water rights, projecting it onto the massive screen behind her for every single resident, reporter, and developer to see. "I don't just own my house, Victoria," I said, my voice eerily calm, amplified across the shocked, breathless room. "I own the water you're standing over. I own the cove where you dock your yacht. And I own the rights to the ecosystem you've been secretly destroying." And before the panicked whispers could even begin, I played the crystal-clear audio recording of her husband, Richard, attempting to bribe me and threatening my sanity, his voice bouncing off the walls, shattering his entire career in front of the local press. But I didn't stop there, bringing up Eleanor's meticulously documented soil and water samples, exposing the massive, unpermitted sewage leaks from the board members' luxury estates, watching the blood violently drain from Victoria's face as the realization hit her that the woman she had mocked for being a blue-collar pipe fitter had outsmarted her from the grave, gathering enough evidence to trigger a massive federal investigation. The absolute, earth-shattering climax arrived when the back doors of the community hall swung open, and three imposing, stone-faced federal marshals, accompanied by agents from the Environmental Protection Agency, walked down the aisle, the heavy jingle of handcuffs silencing the room as they read the arrest warrants for Victoria, Richard, and 4 other board members for conspiracy, extortion, and federal violations of the Clean Water Act, watching them get marched out of the building in absolute disgrace. The developer executives sprinting for the exits like terrified rats abandoning a sinking ship. 6 months later, the morning air is crisp, the lake is healing, and I am sitting on my dock, the 1984 Boston Whaler gleaming beautifully in the sunrise, drinking my coffee in a neighborhood that is finally at peace, knowing that the multi-million-dollar fines levied against the corrupt developers funded a permanent conservation trust in Eleanor's name, while the Sterling family was forced into bankruptcy. Their McMansion sold off to pay their massive legal debts. I spend my weekends now teaching the neighborhood teenagers how to patch fiberglass and turn a wrench, feeling my wife's spirit in every tightened bolt. And just yesterday, I received a phone call from a terrified Marine veteran 2 towns over, his voice shaking as he told me his new HOA was threatening to take his home because his American flag violated their color palette. A call that made me smile, pick up my legal pad, and prepare to go to war all over again. When you strip away the money, the power, and the terrifying legal threats, you have to ask yourself, at what point do we stop letting these self-appointed neighborhood dictators rewrite the rules of our lives? And when do we finally stand up, dig our heels into the dirt, and remind them that a home is not just an asset to be stolen, but a fortress meant to be defended?
Alright, and that is for today's videos. I hope you enjoyed it and found something useful. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe and share it with your friends. Let me know your thoughts in the comment below. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.